I received a compliment the other day, a rather strange compliment. It might have been a backhanded compliment, but someone told me that my punctuation in text messages made me seem well-educated. I think what they meant was that I text like an older person who can't fathom not putting a period at the end of a sentence. See, to some folks, that little period isn't necessary. If I sent the text and it seems like a complete thought, you ought to be able to understand what I'm communicating without that little dot at the end. Characters are precious for some folks in texts and tweets. It's more of an art form to fit complex thoughts into 160 characters, or 280 characters now, I guess. But there are times when a little punctuation mark makes a big difference. Like, I guess if I show you this sentence, it'll make a little more sense, kind of like our story for all ages. If I say, I find inspiration in cooking, my family, and my dog, that's a very different sentence than I find inspiration in cooking, my family, and my dog. And the same thing is true of some spiritual texts. Punctuation matters. One little mark can change the whole theological understanding of a sentence. And different translations of the Bible, for instance, reflect different choices about punctuation. The first time I realized this was many years ago when I was comparing two different translations, because I had gotten a copy of the New World Translation, which is used by Jehovah's Witnesses, and I was interested in how it was different from the translation I was accustomed to using. There's a passage during the story of Jesus's crucifixion where it says he was hung between two thieves, and one of those thieves, moments before he died, accepted that Jesus was the Son of God and repented his misdeeds. And Jesus says to him, "Truly I tell you, today you will be with me in paradise." At least that's what my copy of the Bible said. And in the other copy, Jesus says to the thief, "Truly I tell you today, you will be with me in paradise." Where that comma is placed changes the whole theology, the whole perspective on what happens to you when you die. Is the thief going to be in heaven today, or is there some kind of waiting period before he gets into heaven? This is a real theological debate, and universalists used to have a similar debate. They agreed that everyone was universally saved by God's grace, and therefore everybody gets to go to heaven. But do all people immediately go to heaven? Or do the really bad people go to hell for a little while first and then get to join everyone in heaven later on, eventually, after they've learned their lesson? See, the work of translating the Bible happens after the theological decisions are already made. The Bible doesn't inform the theology of the translators because they have to make choices as they translate. Not only are some of the words subject to interpretation, but ancient Greek and Hebrew had no punctuation at all. The languages didn't even have capital letters. The ancient Greek language didn't even put spaces between the words. Any decisions about punctuation are up to the translator, not the text. The translator's beliefs inform those decisions, just like all the little nuances of our beliefs inform our decisions. If you read one translation of the Bible, you'll be reading the theology of one group of translators. And if you read a different translation, you could see some things that represent a completely different way of reading the text. Now, a lot of folks who read the Bible aren't told that they have to think for themselves, or that the Bible is only going to give them one group's perspective on what their scriptures say. I imagine a lot of folks who wind up in Unitarian Universalist churches come prepared to think for themselves about a lot of things. We don't typically tell people what to believe, but the details of our personal theologies still matter. Many faith traditions are vertical. They're about how people relate to God or the divine. Unitarian Universalism has evolved into a horizontal faith. We focus on our relationships with other people, but those relationships are informed by our personal beliefs. Our relationships are kind of like our scripture. Our relationships are sacred places where we learn about deep things. I was talking with someone recently who has a few tattoos, and I always love to to ask people about their ink. Maybe it seems like a really intimate question, but I found that folks who display art on their bodies are usually eager to talk about what it means to them. And this particular person has a tattoo of a semicolon, not as artsy as some tattoos, but very distinct and visible. So I asked about its meaning. And he explained that he had survived a suicide attempt. And he's really grateful to be alive now because of everything that he's been able to experience since then. Not everyone who attempts suicide has that opportunity. And in punctuation, a semicolon says there's more to come. There's more to the sentence. The sentence isn't over yet. You have to keep reading to get the full message. A period says the sentence is done, but a semicolon means there's something more. One little symbol changes things. So he wears this tattoo of a semicolon to remind himself to be grateful, and also as a testimony to others who might be contemplating suicide, for people who might be wanting to put a period on their lives. He wants them to know that there are good reasons to keep going and see what they can create on the other side of a semicolon. Keep reading, there's more to come. And I just think, wow, he gets how interconnected we all are, that one person's experience affects so many other people, how deeply our lives and experiences affect the world around us. He gets the sacredness of the horizontal. Why isn't he Unitarian Universalist? But I've even learned that it's important for me not to put a period at the end of a relationship with someone, not to write people off and assume that they won't change. I've been tempted to do that in the past. This is who that person is, period. There's nothing more to say about them. No more growth or change is possible. That's the whole story of them. The sentence is over. But people surprise me. They change, they grow. The story of who they are keeps evolving. I need to put a semicolon after my impression of them. This is who I've known them to be, but their story isn't over. And my relationship to them is still sacred. We're still part of the same interconnected web of existence. That's where we focus our spiritual identities as a community of faith. Whatever your theology may be, we covenant to affirm and promote justice, equity, and compassion in our human relationships. That's our second principle. If your personal theology doesn't lead you toward justice, equity, and compassion, there might be a place for you to consider growing. Because I don't care whether you believe in a God or many gods or no gods. I can embrace you, whether you embrace a label of Christian, Muslim, Jewish, Buddhist, pagan, Stoic, humanist, atheist. What matters to me is this sacred horizontal relationship we all share. And I care about whether your beliefs lead you toward creating greater wholeness and well-being in the world. That's where the rubber meets the road. That's what our principles are about. We don't answer the question of where people go when they die or how long it takes them to get there. We choose instead to make a covenant, a mutual promise to one another, that we will allow our personal theologies to move us in a particular direction, that our personal theologies will move us to honor the interdependent web of existence we're a part of, that our personal theologies will move us to envision a global community with peace and liberty and justice for every person. Whatever your personal theology may be, we can count on one another to honor the inherent worth and dignity of every person, every last one. Period. End of sentence. That's where the period goes. It's so tempting to put a comma at the end of those principles. The right of conscience and the use of the democratic process within our congregations and in society at large, except when things take longer than I want them to. Justice, equity, and compassion in human relationships, although I prefer to stay comfortable. Justice, equity, and compassion in human relationships, as long as I don't have to be compassionate toward people I don't like. We honor the inherent worth and dignity of every person, except the people that really upset me. We honor the inherent worth and dignity of every person, except the people who have extreme political views that differ from mine. We honor the inherent worth and dignity of every person, except if honoring their worth would cost me something or require some sacrifice on my part. We honor the inherent worth and dignity of every person, except the people that cause harm. I know that one's tough. But inherent worth and dignity means that you don't have to earn it, you can't lose it, and it can't be taken away from you. And our first principle is that we mutually covenant to affirm and promote the inherent worth and dignity of every person. Period. In our theologies as Unitarian Universalists, that's the punctuation mark that goes there. If your theology wants you to put a comma after those principles and give you an escape hatch, there may be some opportunities to grow there. It's subtle. It's just a little change in our theological punctuation. But there's a big difference between putting a comma at the end of that sentence and putting a period there. And that's one reason why it's important that we build intentionally meaningful, authentic community so that we can live into that challenge together. We can compare one another's translations and ask questions, loving, compassionate questions that accept one another and encourage spiritual growth. That's another one of our principles. In school, we had to worry about getting the punctuation right. In reality, as long as folks clearly understand what we're trying to communicate, maybe it doesn't matter if we put all the proper punctuation precisely where it's supposed to be in a text message. It might help, but it might not be essential. I know some of you are cringing right now. But if you're cringing about that, if you think punctuation is important in a tweet or a text, how important do you think it is in your theology? A subtle little mark makes a big difference in how we live into our beliefs, how we act on our commitments to create greater wholeness or bend the moral arc of the universe toward justice. May we recognize how we can embrace semicolons instead of periods in our relationships, to acknowledge that there is still more of a person's story that we cannot know yet. And may we recognize how we can put periods instead of commas at the end of our principles, so that our commitments have integrity and clarity as we live into our promises in faith with one another. As a reflection today, I invite you to hear our 7 principles and consider where you want to put a comma at the end of any of them, an exception or an escape hatch for yourself. We might put theological punctuation in different places, but we can deepen our sense of personal spirituality and integrity as we honestly and vulnerably share with one another the areas where we see opportunities to grow as we build community together. So reflect on this with me. This is our commitment with all Unitarian Universalists everywhere. We covenant together to affirm and promote the inherent worth and dignity of every person. We covenant together to affirm and promote justice, equity, and compassion in our human relations. We covenant together to affirm and promote acceptance of one another and encouragement to spiritual growth in our congregations. We covenant together to affirm and promote a free and responsible search for truth and meaning. We covenant together to affirm and promote the right of conscience and the use of the democratic process within our congregations and in society at large. We covenant together to affirm and promote the goal of world community with peace, liberty, and justice for all. And we covenant together to affirm and promote respect for the interdependent web of all existence of which we are a part. We might also add our 8th principle in there, as we have done in our covenant and in our bylaws, that we covenant together to accountably dismantle racism and other oppressions within ourselves and in our congregation. So wherever you internally felt a tug to add some clause or caveat to the end of any of those commitments, may you have the courage and the insight to explore that theological punctuation more deeply in the week ahead, so that we might grow in integrity and faith together. Amen, and blessed be.